I should be live. I will wait for YouTube to refresh to ensure that you can all see me. Aha, you can. Hello everyone, happy Saturday. I took the poll that I put out very seriously. For those of you who voted in the YouTube community function on the page, you said that Saturday was the best day to stream, and I've had this one sitting in documents for a while, a couple of days. And I just thought that we would have a nice, relaxed Saturday night stream and have one of these little huddle sessions. You know, mid-game, we're battling out on the field, and sometimes we need to come together, be cozy in amongst ourselves, and discuss some strategy and bounce some ideas around and figure out how to win the game. It was a good analogy that Oren McIntyre used in his recent debate with Joel Berry yesterday on Tim Pool's channel. Well, Tim's debate with Joel Berry and Oren added some colour commentary while he largely watched. Don't worry, Oren, we've all been there, buddy. Love Tim, but Tim also has a lot to say for himself. And Oren did say that it's all well and good to pontificate about the quiet cultural revival, but then actually putting this into practice means that when you're engaged in the game, sometimes you have to huddle the team together and discuss strategy rather than just have a good spirit about what the team is fighting for before you get on the pitch. And so that's what I want to do today, as well as talking about the underlying moral substrate of our political project, to discuss why the current plan of pragmatic, you can just do things, Lee Kuan Yew style liberals that are dominant, ascendant on the right in Britain, unlike in the US where there's still a bit of a battle between the tech bros and the national conservative, very Catholic strain of MAGA, why I don't think they're going to work, what the ideological pitfalls are there. And then we're going to go through super chats at the end, because for those of you who don't know and are watching live, I have this policy, I have for a very long time, where if I'm asked a question, I will do the utmost to respond completely honestly, and the only provisos I have is not to disclose information about someone else if they don't want me disclosing it. But if it's about myself, any questions about what we go over in the live stream, just shoot a super chat and I'll go through them all at the end. And some of you have been kind enough to do so, and reminder, this is my only revenue stream at the moment, it's you guys, which I'm grateful that there has been an audience for this. Like my YouTube videos, other than the one I did on the Labour immigration policy, which perhaps it was too long for YouTube algorithm's attention span, they're all doing pretty well, so thank you, very grateful. And yes, I do read the chat, so I will be. See, has Connor commented on Marjorie Taylor Greene resigning? Massey now stands alone. I met Thomas Massey, he was a very nice chap, actually. I think him and Marjorie Taylor Greene have a, as far as I've seen, completely wrong conception of H-1B visas, because they've defended them at some point, despite being immigration restrictionists. And then I appreciate wanting to be fiscal hawks, because the deficit of the global American empire, it has exceeded its ability to pay it back. One of the reasons that Rome fell is debasing the currency, as well as replacing its standing army with mercantile foreigners, and, you know, making property unaffordable for the majority of the plebs, and rampant sexual licentiousness. I wonder if we're seeing any parallels here. Except, of course, in the current American empire, the clowns have left the circuses used to distract most of the populace, and they've all gone to Congress instead. But if you don't stop demographic replacement, if you don't do mass deportations, then you don't have a republic anymore. And so I think voting against there's a lot of pork in the big beautiful bill, but I do think it was the sensible thing to vote for, just to give ICE loads of funding. As far as MTG resigning, look, my friends on the Hill have mixed opinions about MTG, and they know a lot more about how it is to actually work with someone like that. So I will defer judgment to them. I won't disclose anything that you hear when having dinner parties in Washington and whispers go around. I will say that MTG, I appreciate the fact that they wanted to force the Epstein issue, because we should have transparency on that. If not just to explain why Kash Patel and Pam Bondi and Dan Bongino were so shady about it for so long and went back on their promises. But it is unsurprising that she then gets primaried by the party and Trump if you rebel. And I've heard speculation from other commentators that she's gonna try and make a presidential bid. If Massey gets primaried, I mean, there's a lot of talk at the moment about this insurgent populist coalition outside the Democrats and the Republicans, and you could see an MTG Massey ticket, especially if Trump makes good on his promise to primary Massey. You could see them try and split the right-wing vote. And, well, it'll be fascinating. I still think Vance is probably the best bet. Anyway, so we may as well get into it because there's a few people here now. What I wanted to talk about today is the number of articles that have appeared in the last couple of weeks in the dissident, right-wing, or right-wing adjacent space, the sort of self-styled free-thinker space. And I'm not insulting the people that have written them, I'm only insulting one of the outlets here, which we'll discuss in a moment, that decry the rise of Christian nationalism in Britain. Now, Christian nationalism is a strange phrase to export to Britain, because, well, it's strange in the American context because America has always been a Christian nation, and they're now trying to reverse engineer the ethic that underwrote the founding, but wasn't enshrined explicitly because of Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin's theological hang-ups at the time of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But Christian nationalism at least makes a degree of sense in America. I've read Stephen Wolf's book on it. Harry, while I was at Lotus Eaters, and I did a great stream, actually, on James Lindsay's War on Christian Nationalism, back when he hadn't read the book. I would disagree with some of Stephen Wolf's theology in there, but his idea is essentially you have a Christian magistrate ruling over America to make explicitly Christian laws, and you don't unduly persecute non-Christians, be they atheists or religious minorities that you still want in the country, but you are explicit about the fact that your constitution is only guaranteed by a moral and religious people, and religious meant Christian. Moral meant Christian, according to John Adams. So, to try and reverse engineer a Christian government out of a secular empire ruling over a still Christian people makes a degree of sense. But I quibble the term Christian nationalism in the UK for a couple of reasons. One, nationalism is yet again a product of the Enlightenment. It tries to create a all-binding identity at the level of the nation out of these mainly European nations whose borders and people shifted and changed over time, whereas it doesn't really fit Britain because we were always an island nation, we were a largely homogenous people, we were unmolested for 1,000 years until the Windrush showed up, and then Tony Blair put mass migration on steroids to rub the right's nose in diversity. Consider my nose rubbed well and truly off. So nationalism hasn't always fitted in the UK context because we've always taken demographic givens for granted, and so it doesn't feel like the right term for how we're trying to reverse engineer a homogenous, high-trust cultural England out of the demographic and cultural mess we have at the moment. But the other reason Christian nationalism doesn't really fit is because we do have an established church. We do have a church that is hooked up to the monarchy. The problem is the church is just pathetic. The church is... It is another beam in the leftist cathedral, because it had gay marriage foisted upon it by Gove and Cameron's Conservative Party, and they always touted gay marriage being one of the greatest achievements of the Conservative Party. You know, Conservative Party destroying our understanding of the family, which, again, was the cornerstone of common law, individualism, and it was one of the covenants that keeps a society together. I've had a conversation with the chat's mutual friend, I think, Charlie Downs, one of these principled young men who is also featured in these hit pieces that's going to come out in an episode of Across the Pond either tomorrow at time of filming or next week with Tate Brown about Christianity in Britain, the young right. And he has this framing of, when I've discussed before in articles and on my channel, these concentric circles of meaning, these relationships, these responsibilities of, yes, you have the individual, but then you also have the family, the community, the church congregation, and then the nation. So it creates like a Russian nesting doll that protects the littlest doll if you drop the big doll. If you take all of those concentric circles away, you just have the individual and the Leviathan state, which is what seems both right-wing and left-wing liberals are advocating for, but we'll get onto that in a moment. Downs describes these as the covenants that give a man's life meaning. So you have the original covenant with Adam and man, the creation of woman with Eve, so you have marriage, and then you have the family with God's covenant with Noah to repopulate the earth with his sons. Then you have the tribe with God's covenant with Abraham, and then you have the nation, God's covenant with Moses, and finally you have the ultimate covenant, the establishment of moral universals outside of the very fallen chosen people who were wandering the desert and kept having their nation fall into moral disrepair and having it leveled and rebuilt. You have the establishment of the one true and universal church with Jesus Christ. And this is why you have the Apostle Paul sending out all these letters to all these different tribes who have fallen out of the light of God. This is why at Pentecost, God speaks to all peoples in their specific tongues, because he doesn't want to create a universal homogeneous people, but there is a all-binding ethic, a kind of moral magic, mathematical formula for morality that underwrites the universe. This is what C.S. Lewis called the Tao, right? And so if you belong in those concentric circles, if you fulfill those covenants, if you get married, if you have a family, if you're a pillar of your community, if you belong to a congregation, if you serve your nation in righteous times, of course, because the nation itself has to be righteous, then you are a well-rounded and admirable man. And look, I do my best to do that. I'm sure I fall short many a time, and I'm sure you guys in the comments in the chat can keep me straight, honest, and true. But I do know that there is a number of young men trying to fulfill that on the right in Britain. There are a number of those guys in the US, by the way, and that's the reason that the State Department just declared mass migration, replacement migration, and white flight to be a human rights issue. See my latest video on my channel for that. It's because our guys are in the State Department, they think the same way, they have the same convictions, and the only reason things aren't getting done is because a bunch of crusty old liberal boomers who are permanent bureaucrats in there that can't be fired are gumming up the works. But they're getting some stuff done, and it's good. So it's encouraging that these guys are coming through. But they're meeting resistance. And they're meeting resistance by being gate-kept out of institutions, as we've discussed before on the stream about gatekeeping, and they're meeting resistance in exoteric fashion now. Our names are being criticised frequently in the press, and the same sort of proxy war on J.D. Vance becoming the heir apparent to MAGA, you're seeing rumblings of that starting to be waged in the UK. And one of the figures that they've picked is my friend, came to my wedding, Cambridge academic James Orr, who is the kind of person who does afford opportunities to young people. Now, James has invited me to a few events before. All of my career is basically made off my own back, plus opportunities afforded to me by the great Carl Benjamin, and with Courage Media founded by Ayaan Hirsi Ali. But I've met the people that James has provided, career opportunities and that too. Excellent, enterprising, sharp minds. Some of them do have the temperaments of academics, which means they aren't workaholics like me. I am the worst Catholic in the world. I have a very Protestant work ethic, as you can tell by the fact that I'm streaming. Though I'm not streaming on Sunday. We keep the Sabbath on Sunday. Thank you very much. So, hey, maybe I get let off that hook. I will be writing tomorrow, though. But James really does care about paying these opportunities forward, and he's one of the only ones that does. And so there is a proxy war on what I think is James Orr to take him out of the running as Nigel Farage's successor, now that he's joined Reform, to leave only Zia Yusuf on the table instead. And Zia Yusuf is an avatar of the opposite faction in the British right at the moment. The dominant faction, I would say. He's not the only avatar. I would say Dominic Cummings is a kind of avatar of this as well. And to a lesser extent, Robert Jenrick, but he has declared himself an Anglo-futurist, and this is this kind of mentality. The dominant strain of right-wing thought in Britain right now is you can just do things liberalism. It wants to reverse engineer a functioning society out of Britain by copying Lee Kuan Yew's technological authoritarianism from Singapore, and it thinks that any conversations about post-liberalism or a Christian revival are icky, and so it doesn't want to deal with them. So I thought we'd go through those articles today. One thing I do want to bring to your attention, though, based on the previous conversation that we had about containment operations, and I have seen a super chat here that I said I would leave till last, but I will address this. Are you Anglican or Catholic, Connor? I am a Catholic. I was baptised Catholic. My mum's side of the family are Irish. My nan came from Ireland. So I only went back to church as a teenager because we didn't go regularly until my uncle died, and it ravaged the family quite a lot. My grandparents got quite involved in Catholic charities. My mother took me. I took St. Anthony as my confirmation name. Patron saint of lost things, but also because my uncle's name was Anthony, so there's kind of nominative determinism there. And I then strayed away a little bit because I was an impatient kid and I wanted to go back and play my DS and my Xbox. I've spent a lot of time playing Black Ops 2 and then looking what Black Ops 7's turned into. Man, it really just is third world slop now, isn't it? Like, blimey, I'm glad I've quit multiplayer games. But anyway, after I strayed away from video games and actually, knuckled down at university and spent a lot of time researching things, because you had to do a lot of your own reading if you didn't just want to become a total NPC along with all of the other students and the seminar leader who didn't even read the text they were set and just recited intersectional talking points. When I was doing a lot of that research, I obviously, like many men, got into politics through the SJW, destroyed compilations, and this, at the time, featured Jordan Peterson. I watched Jordan Peterson's biblical lectures, I read Maps of Meaning, and through an intellectual curiosity, and then obviously C.S. Lewis as well, I came around to Christianity being the objective moral substrate that works in all times and all places, and if these guys, for thousands of years, who built my civilization, got all of these predictions right, especially, whether you take it as an analogy or not, the fact that there are demonic forces at work in the world, when you maximize individual autonomy, you end up committing atrocities in the name of your freedom. Then if they got all those predictions right, with a completely different moral framework than the one we're living in now, and current society is fallen and perhaps terminally fallen, then they must have something correct that I didn't. And what actually made me click and become a fully tithe-paying member of weekly Sunday Mass attendance was actually a conversation with Nick Dixon, who, good guy, much like me, was sort of struggling to be the continent man before the virtuous man in Christianity. And he said, the thing that made me just believe in Christianity is I was engaged in this intellectual exercise of justifying Christianity, but I thought, oh, well, I can justify it intellectually, and I can justify it as a cultural Christian, but I can't really believe it. And then I just told myself, well, what if you just believe it, you idiot? Like, what if you make the choice to believe it, to subordinate your doubts in all humility to the fact that it seems to work in all times and all places, it's our people's tradition, it built our civilization, and you're just probably wrong. And that's what made it click for me. And so, through a pattern of repetition, through learning, through enmeshing myself in the congregation, through now going with my wife, I can say that it is an integral part of my life. Anyway, so you got that for £10. So I hope you enjoyed your mini podcast. What do you say? I provide you guys with some value. Anyway, the thing that interested me was, first of all, to put on your radar, was this. So they're Unherd, which is an outlet that we have discussed before. As part of the Paul Marshall Network, this sort of... It's the cathedral of the British right, basically. Pretty much all the political parties and the outlets that you read and the think tanks that produce think pieces that manufacture consent for what the parties already want, they are all within the sphere of influence of this one guy, Paul Marshall, who you might know as Winston Marshall's dad, who appointed Michael Gove as the editor of The Spectator. So Unheard have basically banned me from all their events. So I can't go to this. And it's a shame, because it's actually quite an interesting event, right? Because Rod Dreher has waded into this Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson, woke right controversy, and I hope Rod doesn't mind me saying this. I've spoken to Rod before. He was very complimentary about my work. At some point, he shared my essays before, and I ran into Rod in early August in Hungary, because we were at the same event, and I asked him about his woke right article for the Free Press, and I said I disagree with the term, and I asked why he was using it when it's obviously just a gatekeeping mechanism used by yesterday's liberals to rearrange the furniture on the right, because it's ended up as their refugee camp, and they just feel icky about being in coalition with people who have actual principles and don't just want to, consolidate the gains of the previous revolution and just rewind it to a place that they were comfortable with in the 90s. And he was saying, he was talking to a bunch of... What's the school that you guys would say in America that's between elementary and high school? That age. He was talking to a bunch of teachers in sort of 10-year-old to 15-year-old range. And they were saying that loads of boys in their school were saying, well, Second World War, who cares? Hitler was right, Churchill's terrible. And so they're genuinely worried about this sort of trickling down. And so he was taking aim at a particularly vitriolic form of white identitarianism. Now, I come at this from the opposite perspective, by the way. Not Hitler was right perspective, but I come at this from the perspective of, what did you expect when you allowed every single group, including on the right, to play identity politics, and then you disrupt, via demographic and cultural means, the pre-political we, which has to be settled in order to discuss anything to do with the economy, or energy, or logistics, or housing, or anything. Like, you have to know the constituency on whose behalf you are bargaining in order to collectively bargain. And if one group is told you're just atomized individuals, and then the other group is told by the left, well, you're the collective enemies of history, and the only time you can have a collective identity is when we can beat you with the cudgel of inexpugnable historical guilt. And then they look to their allies on the right, and then they will ally with people from the left who hate white people to smack down any time that they engage in identity politics on behalf of the English or heritage Americans. And identity politics is often just defined as noticing that you exist, and noticing that you have some positive attributes rather than just exist as a group that deserves to be basically ethnically cleansed. And they notice the fact that those people on their side that don't like them playing white identity politics are very pro-Indian or Jewish identity politics. And sorry, that's just a contradiction that can't stand. So why are you surprised about this? As well, this is obviously discussing Tucker Carlson, Ben Shapiro, Nick Fuentes, the guys that the establishment conservative Inc. commentators decry as beyond the moral pale for either the insulting things they say about Israel and Jews or just the half jokes they make about women and black people. A lot of this rhetoric you wouldn't hear out of place in a Call of Duty lobby. Like, a lot of us, I'm sure I'll see in the chat in a bit, a lot of us will have cut our teeth on Call of Duty, right? Most online game chats will have far worse slurs thrown at us, and it's just water off our duck's back, right? So lots of guys find this funny. At the very least, even if they don't listen to it, they don't find it shocking. So a lot of this comes off like a moral panic, and it comes off like a moral panic by people who vacated the field by not talking to white men as white men, who said that if you talk to white men as white men, it's evil and irredeemable and literally Hitlerian, and we will ally with the left in order to keep your career dead. We'll cut you off at the knees. And they also didn't field a candidate of their own. Like, there are no under 30s talking to young white men as young white men. Even Charlie Kirk was over 30, and even he was getting frustrated with the pro-Israel faction, the Israel First faction, of the right when they were trying to cancel Tucker Carlson or cancel the debate between Dave Smith and Josh Hammer. Like, sorry, but if you guys are pissing off Charlie Kirk, God rest his soul, before he was dead, then you're going about it the wrong way. So the reason I bring this event up is because I'm not allowed to go, but as I said last time, we should be going to these events, right? We, in terms of the collective we who understand what's going wrong with the country, who notice contradictions, who want to press on uncomfortable topics in a gentlemanly and well-informed way that don't just spurg out about it. Because the success of the Gripper movement in the US, before a lot of it turned digital, and some of the people who are very antisocial gave it a bad name by just going in people's comments and posting all sorts of sordid stuff that is unbecoming of we gentlemen. But the success of the Gripper movement is actually well put together young guys, and this is still happening, right? Went to Q&As in person, put their face to their ideas, and just plainly said what they believed at Q&As. They confronted the architects of their immiseration, or the containment agents on the right, or people like Charlie Kirk who were earnest and interested in solving problems, but just hadn't had their software updated from talk radio conservatism yet. They went and asked them uncomfortable questions, like, why are you platforming a guy, Rob Smith, who was doing gay sex hookup ads as a conservative? Why are we not allowed to collectively bargain in our interests, but, you know, we have all these Israeli interest lobbies on our side that's meant to be against identity politics? Why don't you care about mass legal migration and only mass illegal immigration when the cultural change and the economic impacts remain basically the same? And so you need to pull on these threads of these contradictions. So you can just go and get a ticket. Like, you can just go do that. In fact, I think it's a great idea for you to do that. I think I can post a link in the chat, can't I? Can I not put the... There I can. Right. There you go. I think you guys should go if you've got the time on Monday night. And you should sign up for these events and, you know, go and ask people questions. And Rod's been very polite to me, so be very polite to him if you do decide to go. Now, let's hammer on this left-right divide. Because I think there's a left-right divide within the British right, and it's represented by two factions, as I've said. It's represented by the Charlie Downs faction. So I've liked this tweet. I don't necessarily agree with that it's the only question that matters. It is the preeminent question, whether or not you agree with the capital T truth, whether or not you buy into the moral substrate that made England England. I think that it's not the only question, but I understand why Downs is saying it's the most important. Allow me to walk you through it, right? A lot of people think that mass deportations or remigration is the fix everything switch, and it's the fix most things switch, right? What it does is it resets us to a place where we have a pre-political we, so we just talk about matters that are of immediate internal concern to us. We can address the economy, we can address energy, we can address housing, we can address problems of antisocial behaviour that arise from our population rather than the imported, inconsiderate clans of the third world. All great. But it's not to fix everything, Switch, right? Trust me, I want to press the switch. We want to press the switch. We are switch pressers in this household. However, if you press that switch, we still have William Hill betting shops lining our high streets, right? That's the only thing that won't close down when you get rid of all the dodgy migrant vape shops and Turkish-ish barbers and nail bars and all of these like obvious fronts for foreign criminals, right? You're still going to have a problem with binge drinking in the older generation, so that's dropping off a bit among Zoomers. Now, partially, that's because so many of the young Zoomers are Muslim, but I know anecdotally a lot of just young English Zoomers who just don't drink as much as their parents do. Like, their parents might have a glass of wine a night. Some of the boomers are just chronic alcoholics. It's just endemic to that generation. And Gen X as well, because remember, Gen X was the first generation that went out to bars in the aftermath of the contraceptive pill, and so you had the ladette culture. And so that's why you get this like really boomer advice from well-meaning 50-year-olds that go, well, just go to a bar and talk to a nice girl if you're single. It's like, yeah, that's going to work when everyone's sat at tables in Wetherspoons with QR codes and... yeah, no. There's no cultural cross-contamination there anymore. Anyway, so there's going to be lots of cultural issues that we still have to alleviate, right? Like not working class culture. There's an underclass culture of benefit dependence of people who are just congenital addicts. You know, there's still loads of white people that smoke weed every day. Not good. It makes you fat, lazy, and retarded, okay? So we've got problems to fix. And the problem that gets fixed with that is a revival of a normative moral order. And I don't see any other normative moral order that has led to peace, prosperity, and flourishing, and especially made our civilization, like particularly made England, than Christianity. Now, we might debate the denomination. We'll get round to that later. No more brother wars for now. You know, we're under siege as it is. And we're under siege from our own churches, of course. You know, I'm a long-suffering Catholic. The last few popes have been... well, Benedict had some good writings on technology, but the last two popes, not great. Especially on migration. Anyway, I don't see how we fix those problems without a reinstantiation of the Logos, of the importance of Imago Dei, of a proportionate sense of justice, of all of these things that are derived from Christianity. I don't see how we don't do this by undoing the false assumptions of liberalism and evicting the heretical religions that have taken root in our politics and are supreme over Christianity. And that's all heretical religions, by the way. Just allow me to make that clear. All religions, except Christianity, are incorrect. They are false. That is a third rail that most people won't touch. That doesn't mean I have animus towards all religions. I vehemently oppose Islam, and I think it's demonic. And I think Hinduism is probably demonic as well. But, like, I don't have outrage about Buddhism. So, this is just an observation. It's a truth claim as a Catholic. And as a Christian, you have to think all other religions are false, because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. There is no way through the Father except through him. Okay? Just categorical. Alright? Not even being mean, just true. So, I don't see how England becomes what it used to be without both mass deportations, remigration, and Christian revival. That's going to be difficult for most people. Fortunately, well, this audience, but also principled young men entering politics, like Mr. Charlie Downs, heterosexual, monogamous, married, focused, locked in, can't be blackmailed men who are Christians are spearheading this. I tweeted the other day, by the way, I was going to caption this video of two prominent right-wing activists arguing about... it was... I think... who was it? It was the Hugh Anthony guy and this black woman. And I haven't met any of them, I don't know either of them, but I know one of them's gay and one of them's a black woman. And they were arguing over which one of them is a homosexual versus which one of them is going to be remigrated. And I at that moment, I just felt like being a heterosexual white man, like monogamous, married, in right-wing politics is both a superpower and fucking exhausting. It's so tiring because, like, I know the Americans can relate to this, the fact that they're running Winsome Sears, and for ages you've had boomer politicians pandering to the marginal sliver of the black vote that might break for them if they fund more historically black colleges and let more murderers out of prison. Honestly, like, all of our mainstream media outlets are basically at that stage, or they have been for a very long time. It's starting to lift a bit, but for a while, especially during BLM, they thought that you could only say right-wing things, and these are tepidly, like, you know, I'm still a liberal, but the left have gone too far level of right-wing things, if you put them in the mouth of a gay person or a black person who had broken from the coalition. Absolutely tiring. Now, what we're seeing instead is, through sheer force of will, despite attempted gatekeeping, guys like Downs and Lewis Brackpool and Harrison Pitt, and hopefully myself, are coming through. But we've had to build our own citadels, right? This is why so many of us are over at Restore UK. Announcement pending. But there is another strain on the right, and that is everyone who hates this. And they are the sort of dominant strain. This is the, we can just do things, we're liberals, England has always been liberal. It should be ethnically particular, but it's not, because its brand ambassador is like Zia Yusuf. It's the very Silicon Valley mentality of they are only temporarily embarrassed liberals, and they're frustrated that woke liberalism won out rather than technocratic, competitive individualism, because wokeness is dysgenic and their stuff is eugenic. Like, if you talk to a lot of the advocates of Anglofuturism, for example, and they're nice guys, they've got the Faustian spirit of the Anglo, right? There's two spirits, I think. There's the Hobbit mentality, which I think is probably best summed up by our good friend Carl Benjamin, who loves England, loves the Shires, set up Lotus Eaters in Swindon so he could cycle to work. There was no more thinking that went into it. God bless him. Love him. Swindon is a shithole, though. Never go there. And he's totally unbothered about Mars. Like, he looks up at space and just thinks, shrug. Like, so... And I kind of empathise with that a bit more. I mean, I speak to you guys at length. I rant endlessly. And anyone who's met me in person, I would hope that they think that I am gentlemanly enough to them, despite me not being an extrovert. I have this policy that I've adopted from Stefan Molyneux. Excellent bit of advice from that guy, where he said, treat people as well as you can the first time you meet them, and then treat them as they treat you every instance after that. So if anyone runs into me, and when I'm travelling through London, I've been recognised fairly frequently. Literally on Saturday, I was sat down in a steak restaurant in Covent Garden. Scottish guy comes over, taps me on the shoulder, buys a drink for the table, says hello. If you're watching this, you're a patriot. Thank you. I didn't pay you to come over, even though that's what my wife and my friends accuse me of doing. So if you've met me, hopefully, you know, I'm sociable. But I like nothing more than confining myself to my small patch of land just outside of London, as the last white guy left in London, tending to my garden and barely speaking to anyone. Okay? That's the Hobbit mentality of the Anglo. There was a weave there, I promised, I'm still on topic. The Anglo-futurist mentality is the seafaring Anglo. They're the spirits who went over and went to America by their own volition, or Australia, not by their own volition, and they're the guys that want to build space stations with thatched roofs. And this is the kind of strain that you're seeing in right-wing liberalism. And this is why a lot of them love Lee Kuan Yew. They cite Lee Kuan Yew a lot because they believe that technological progress and just a kind of will to power can solve any problems, and so they're frustrated by the existence of the civil service and the blob just getting in their way of doing things. There's no necessary underlying philosophical commitment. It's just a drive towards efficiency and lower P progress, like not, you know, the long arc of history bends towards justice progress that Martin Luther King plagiarized from a theologian. Instead, it's the idea that you can turn your country into the best performing Silicon Valley startup. And this is actually best summarized by the Pimlico Journal crowd, which is why Nigel Forrester, who is the editor of Pimlico Journal, responded to this tweet, just saying that no, not everything flows downstream as to whether or not you're a Christian, or on the side of Christianity. You know, we have Christian co-belligerents who struggle to come to the faith, and we pray that they do, in their own way. Nigel, and I don't want to attack Pimlico Journal, guys, by the way, I want to preface all of my criticism with this. the Pimlico Journal guys do good work, even though they have a tendency of nipping at my heels. I think I've had like 2 named and at least 1 veiled hit piece from Pimlico at this point. Come on, guys. I appreciate your work on social housing. You know, it's a bit tiresome. But Pimlico epitomized this mentality. And Pimlico also make lots of references to Lee Kuan Yew. They have the same interest in Lee Kuan Yew as the likes of Dominic Cummings does with Otto von Bismarck. And the reason I'm bringing up Lee Kuan Yew is because the reason that I don't think right-wing liberalism works is because people forget that Lee Kuan Yew modelled Singapore off of Britain. He came over in 1946 to visit post-war Britain, and he was wandering through, I think it was either Trafalgar or Piccadilly Square, might be Piccadilly, and he saw this newspaper stand where people would walk up and deposit a coin or a shilling note. He told this in a speech in 2002, and he said the fact that people just put their coin in and took their newspaper and walked away without stealing the stack to sell for themselves like they would in South Asia, that is civilization. Now, people go, look at the success that Lee Kuan Yew had with his reforms, creating a simulacra of organic, high-trust, bottom-up British society. We should fold those back on Britain now that we are demographically fractured, culturally incoherent, low trust, high crime, like all of these undesirable things. And what I might remind people is the fact that he modelled himself on Britain means that Britain had the secret sauce before we polluted it with mystery meat, right? And so we can press the fix everything button to go back to the demographics of 1946, but we don't have the cultural memory ingrained. And why was that cultural memory there? Why was it, even if everyone wasn't going to Mass or Anglican service on a Sunday or, you know, God forbid, one of these other denominations, why was that high trust society a habit for Anglos? Why has it been a habit for Anglos everywhere they've gone? Yes, the Americans are slightly more boisterous. Yes, the Aussies are slightly more blunt. But why is this common across the Anglosphere? And the reason is Christianity, as much as our ethnic German ancestry, read Tacitus' description of the tribes of Germania for their sort of sense of fairness, their high sense of morality, how eventually when some of the barbarian tribes had come to Rome, they would rebuke them for just being whores. That, combined with Christianity, made the English. So Alan McFarlane's book is good on this, The Origins of English Individualism. The reason that the English took to liberalism, or they invented liberalism, as a kind of ideology of how the English treat one another, is because they had nuclear family units. It's because they didn't just interact with their cousins and their clan as they do on the small tribal networks of South Asia, Africa, etc. Instead, they had very low rates of cousin marriage, they had non-existent rates of sibling marriage and child marriage. That's very important because India still has loads of child marriages, and that means that their population is developmentally stunted. And so, you had to develop an ethic that extends moral consideration outside of the family and your cousins and your wider clan network. And that means that you had to have manners and moral consideration, and universalism became second nature to them. And it became second nature because of family structure, but also because of Christianity. Because Christianity also shaped the family structure. It was the first Archbishop of Canterbury that banned cousin marriage. It was the popes in the 13th century that enforced that ban. They ratified it out across all of Christendom. Even after Henry VIII abolished cousin marriage to marry his second wife, I think it was. Because Anne Boleyn was a cousin of Catherine of Aragon. Very confusing man, our first black king, clearly. So even after he abolished it, the general population didn't practice cousin marriage at high rates. And this is why anytime you criticize cousin marriage on Twitter, as I'm wont to do, you get a bunch of Muslims and even Indians in your mentions going, oh, but Queen Victoria, oh, but Queen Elizabeth. It's like, yeah, this was a thing at the upper echelons of society. A few monarchs did it. The general population has never done it. And that's why we have high IQs, it's why we have high impulse control, and that's why we can extend moral consideration to people beyond ourselves. It's why Anglos are basically the only group in the world that has an out-group preference on the liberal perimeters. And even those who are right-wing, like you and me, who have in-group preferences, we aren't disdainful towards people purely on the basis of their complexion or their skin colour. We judge people by the content of their character, not the colour of their skin. It just so happens that entire countries are deficit in content of character. Not my fault, your culture sucks. So, the problem that the right-wing liberals have is they don't recognise this. They don't recognise all of the givens upon which their we can just do something mentality sits. You know who did recognize this? Lee Kuan Yew. So Lee Kuan Yew has a series of very interesting quotes. Because South Asia is, based on the geography, based on the population churn, is ethnically and religiously, and thereby culturally, heterogeneous. And so, in order to have a imitation of high trust, ethnically, culturally homogenous English culture, you have to enforce standards from a militant secular state that is willing to apply force for the slightest of punishments, like spitting gum on the floor gets you caned, based, and you need to be indifferent to any given conception of the good except publicly neutral liberalism. And the enforcement cost increases proportionate to the heterogeneity of your ethnic and cultural population. And even though Singapore is, according to its UN reports that I've been reading recently for an essay, proudly multiracial, proudly multicultural, hosts various religions, Lee Kuan Yew, while he was still alive, God rest him, frequently said, in 1985, for example, that on a previous occasion, had the mix in Singapore been different, had it been 75% Indian, 15% Malay, and the rest Chinese, it would not have worked. Because they believe in the politics of contention, of opposition, but because the culture was such that the populace sought a practical way out of their difficulties, therefore it has worked. Right, so it needs to be a guaranteed ethnic cultural bloc that are the majority of a country in order for the country to be stable. And their dominance needs to be an unquestioning majority. It's why the Han Chinese population of Singapore is basically frozen at 74-75%. Otherwise it wouldn't have worked. And this is also the case with Israel, by the way, like, whenever you bring up that Israel is an ethno-state, you get this cope from liberals in the West, or even some Jewish people, who say, well, actually, you know, we've got like a 20% Arab population, and we've got Druze that can serve in the military, and the Arabs have representation in the Knesset, and we're so progressive, we even allow basically a Muslim Brotherhood party to sit in the Knesset. And it's like, okay, guys, but if you could kick them all out of the country, you would. Like, it's just because you're surrounded on all sides by Muslim veritable terror states, and even the ones who aren't currently trying to shell you with mortars, they wouldn't take too kindly to kicking out a bunch of Muslims. Like, if you could have an ethnically pure Jewish state, you would. Like, you have basically an ethnically pure ruling class. Ashkenazis basically run the entirety of Israel. There's currently a Sephardic Jew who's spurging out about it against Barry Weiss and Ben Shapiro on Twitter because he wasn't invited to one of their Jewish congregation events. It's a whole thing. I'm not going to get involved. It's very Jewish. It's not my thing. So, the idea that an ethnically homogenous country pressing the fix everything switch wouldn't just fix everything. Bullshit, frankly. And so Lee Kuan Yew recognized this because in 1998 in his book, he said, I have said openly that if we were 100% Chinese, we would do better. But we are not, and we will never be, so we live with what we have. Okay, let's give a hypothetical to our right-wing liberal friends. If we could be, let's be charitable and say 99% white British. The kind of demographics that we were when Lee Kuan Yew visited in 1946. If we could return to that, then why would we need to turn ourselves into multi-ethnic, multiracial, liberal, Leviathan Singapore, rather than just going back to what we were, which Singapore copied? Like, if we could just return to basically 100% white British, let's be charitable, right? Let's be really progressive here, guys. Let's say we return to 95%, because of course there are mixed ethnic marriages, including with our friends on the European continent, including with heritage Americans, who, yes, are largely ancestrally Anglo or Scotch-Irish, but they wouldn't be counted as indigenous Brits, at least in the first generation. Let's say we could go back to 95%. Why wouldn't we just do that? Why would we accept living in a liberal pluralist panopticon, which I don't think is going to work anyway, as a simulacra of our old country, rather than just returning to what our country used to be before the Windrush rocked up and we bought the lie of post-war liberalism that said that because the Germans buggered up nationalism twice, we suddenly have to treat everyone as a blank slate and act as if a man from Mogadishu can move over to Manchester and become as British as you and me. Spoiler alert, he can't. Like, his culture, his intelligence, his 1,000 years of cousin marriage being worn on his face kind of prevents him from being indistinguishable from the native population. Sorry, hate fact, but What are you going to do? I would rather have a country than, not get called racist by a bunch of people that want to destroy said country. Who cares? So, if we could do that, why don't we? And this isn't what's being proposed by the right-wing liberals in question. Instead, they're just saying, well, we kind of have to accept our demographic givens. We should only get rid of people who aren't economically productive because they only value things that basically measure on a spreadsheet. They only want to maximize efficiency. And so they're residing us with this settlement of a demographically and culturally incoherent country, rather than returning us to a much more workable place where we can have internal coherent conversations about, yes, the things that they care about, like economics and energy, but also culture. And yes, we're going to have that icky conversation about Christianity again, especially because of the rapid explosion of conversions to Catholicism among young men. So, I wanted to check in on this piece from the Pimlico Journal, because Pimlico took a few shots at myself and Charlie Downs in a piece titled Against Christian Nationalism, and it warns that reform could become Christian nationalist, because Danny Kruger, and I happen to know that Danny Kruger's staffers, who I had the pleasure of meeting, sorry, my coaster was stuck to my cup, they apparently read and watch my stuff, so if you're reading, gents, hello, keep up the good work. But Danny Kruger defected to Reform UK from the Conservatives, and Danny Kruger is squishy on the English identity question, but he's very sound on Christian history. And he's been very good on questions of life, on abortion and assisted dying. So I appreciate what he wants to do there. But the fact that he defected, and then James Orr joined him, is a sign to the Pimlico Journal that reform are trending to Christian. Now, it was not a sign to the Pimlico Journal, who ran an article called Why I Am a Zionist, that was so bad I genuinely thought it was excellent satire. I'm not shitting you. I know people say that. I read the article and thought it was satirical, and I was going to share it. And then I realized when I went to the guy's Twitter account, who was sharing like Chapel Rowan fan cams, oh wow, no, this is just a gay leftist writing in the Pimlico Journal. That's weird. So, they didn't find reform, they didn't find it troubling, that reform has two unelected Muslim spokespeople. That's Layla Cunningham, that's Celia Yusuf. Now, Layla Cunningham's married to a Christian, but she's still a Muslim mum of 7, so... And they're also pushing her as their potential London mayoral candidate. It's like, oh, brilliant, you're based right-wing populist party, guys. You're going to put Muslim candidate up against Labour gay race communism Muslim candidate. Where's the British representation here? And also, just putting forward Muslim candidates means the patriotic British public, the majority of whom are already open about the fact that they don't think being Muslim is compatible with being British. I mean, look at the polling from YouGov a couple of months ago that said 53% of the public just said it outright. The fact that they're waiting to see whether or not the rug is pulled out from moderate Muslim voters that will suddenly vote reform, according to Majid Nawaz, because they've got Muslims in the party and because Nigel Farage has always batted away any criticism of Islam. It's the reason he left UKIP in 2018 was the presence of Tommy Robinson and their, quote, obsession with Islam. The idea that the British public should be waiting to see whether or not the rug is pulled out from those moderate Muslims, or themselves, is not a position that you, a right-wing populist party, that claims to represent the left-behind majority, should be putting yourself in. But very curious that there was a pro-Zia article written, but not a against Muslims in reform article that was prompted by the fact that they're now 2 for 2 with Muslim and Christian spokespeople, right? So in this, there is the... No, I won't subscribe. I'm sorry. Sorry, Pimlico. I do read your stuff, but I'm not subscribing because I don't like emails. In this is the complaint that for purely electorally expedient reasons, because regular church-going is in decline among the general population, it would be unwise for reform to put anything explicitly Christian or anything that smells like Christian moralizing in their next manifesto. That includes, for example, limits or reductions on abortion. So the official abortion limit in the UK is 24 weeks, but it has been decriminalised now, thanks to a private member's bill pushed forward by Antonia Antoniazzi and the one that was shot down by devouring mother Stella Creasy. That was just the moderate version was Antonia Antoniazzi's, because it kept a ban on sex-selective abortions. Because, of course, the problem is not killing a baby, the problem is killing a baby because it's a girl. If you just kill the baby indifferent of his gender, how progressive. So, the idea that as Nigel Farage had said, he was always quote-unquote pro-choice, but that was going too far, and that because of medical technology, you can save babies at earlier stages of viability. The idea that that settlement needs to be revisited shouldn't be included, according to the Pimlico guys. Instead, you should just focus on immigration and talk predominantly about how it takes up social housing, how it eats up welfare, how it's causing crime, rather than questions of identity, whether or not integration actually works, because we're not running a hypothetical experiment at this point. Like, you're not exactly going to post copies of John Stuart Mill for every letterbox in Bradford, are you? So, but they shouldn't address those things, and they certainly shouldn't address questions of abortion, euthanasia, the sanctity of life, and model themselves as a Christian party in the same way that even non-Christian candidates, like, let's say, Donald Trump, he hasn't always lived in the most Christian way, even though he may be coming around to it, especially in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's death, or especially Vivek Ramaswamy, have to cosplay as Christians to win evangelical support, because politics still is permeated by a Christian feeling in the Republican Party. And so, they're saying that reform should steer well clear of anything Christian. There should be no public professions of faith. This, of course, is not, as I have noted, extended to other faiths. Very interesting. But there was this paragraph here where it says, despite these obvious truths, there are some who wish reform would move in a different direction, filling the pages of their next manifesto with the whims and wishes of conservative Christians. Whilst a tiny fraction of the British population, these people are particularly prominent online. It's the online right again, guys. It's me. Hi, I'm the online right. It's me. I personally estimate, the author writes, that they make up only 13% of British right-wing X users, but are responsible for over 50% of coal posted online. Cranking out the Vanta Black fuel here over at Tomlinson Talks, with personalities such as Connor Tomlinson and Charlie Downs advocating for the recentering of the right around political Christianity. Well, it's not even political Christianity, it's just Christianity. Like, this is the false distinction. Again, it's present in the liberal framing of this, and it's the same when most people talk about Islam, including people that understand the problem. Like, Ayaan Hirsi Ali does this all the time. Islamism or political Islam. No, it's just Islam. And it's because you cannot compartmentalize a comprehensive metaphysical doctrine of good and evil, of judgment, of justice, of the worth of the human person. Like, Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, who LARPs as English, she says that her Sunni Muslim faith is what drives her to political service. And it instructs everything she does in life. I believe her, and that's honest. The Michaela School approach says, yeah, you can wear your hijab to school, but as long as you sing Rudyard Kipling and recite God Save the King, you're English or British or whatever, and that 5 years at Michaela School will have more of a hold over you than, your family and your faith, yeah, that's absurd. Something I brought up to Catherine in the debate footage, which has still been buried. You still have time to remind Michael Gove that you want to see that. Lots of you have been, by the way. Actually, let's take a look at the spectators' comments, because there's been a trend here. This is a complete detour, but there's been a trend where any time there has been an episode of Mr. Go's podcast, comments. There we go. I hate YouTube, by the way. See, top one. Go to this one. You guys are just champions. Well done. Anyway, so you're welcome to remind him of that. But the idea that you can compartmentalize a comprehensive doctrine of the good to be nothing more than exotic clothing and food and private worship that is completely divorced from public activity or politics, it's absurd. And it is betrayed, this sort of very Protestant, frankly, concept of the public-private distinction is betrayed by the idea of a political Christianity. No, there would be no political Christianity. It would just be Christianity. Like, Christianity would inform my politics. It always informs my politics. It informs all of my relationships. It is my morality. And so, a morality doesn't exist outside of doing things with other people. Like, you can't be moral on a desert island because there's nobody to be on the receiving end of your treatment of them. So the idea that you could be political without Christianity, without a comprehensive doctrine of the good, this is the kind of thing that Schmitt would talk about. The myth of liberal neutrality, because liberalism presumes itself to be above all other philosophies. It presumes itself to be a container in which all of these things can sit comfortably and be reconciled. The idea is that liberalism is a comprehensive doctrine of the good, but it believes itself not to be. It believes itself to be the container in which all other comprehensive doctrines can sit and be contained. And so anytime one of these doctrines tries to jostle for supremacy, naturally recognizing its incompatibility, its irreconcilability with the other, then the containment kicks in. And so what this is, and I'm not accusing them of being consciously containment, like I am the Marshall Network, which we'll get to in a bit, but this is trying to contain the jostling of one comprehensive doctrine of the good with the competition with the other, which is Islam, for example, or wokeness in this regard. And what they want is an even balance of all of these doctrines, but they want them done in private, not in their face, and to have no bearing on politics, which I think is, as Schmitt would say, sorry, politics boils down to friend-enemy, and friends and enemies are defined by whether or not you buy into a given totalizing existential conception of the good. And the idea that liberalism is not itself an existential conception of the good, and it can contain those other conceptions of the good without the war of all against all breaking out, is just an obscurity. It's just a myth, and it blinds us to existential cataclysms coming down the track. Schmitt believed these were spiritual when he said that we would basically be subjected to a force not of this world. You can take that or leave that. If you're Peter Thiel, that's your source of belief in the Antichrist, I suppose. I would suggest looking in a mirror for candidates. Or you can take it metaphorically and say the attempt to preclude Christianity from the restoration of Britain is leaving a moral vacuum that will be filled by another ideology or religion that doesn't share your liberal Protestant informed priors, and they won't respect this delicate balance of privately observed conceptions of the good, and so you're just going to get a caliphate by force. And whether or not your Leviathan state can accurately enforce liberalism on top of a barbarian horde full of low IQ cousin marrying barbarians, good luck. I'd rather just never be in that situation in the first place. I'd rather send them back to the Horn of Africa. Like, that would be my thinking. Instead, it seems not to be the thinking of all the people at Pimlico Journal. And this author writes, following this path would be a disaster for reform. I say that as a conservative Christian myself. I oppose abortion and euthanasia, but the fact is, the general public simply do not agree with the Christian perspective on these issues. The best way to avoid worsening the current settlement on such things is in fact to avoid bringing them up in the first place, not to actively campaign on them. Okay, so I take this chap's Christian profession on its face, not going to question it, right? What I am going to question is the following two things. Whether or not you are willing to force the issue will be forced. And it will be forced, as it was in America prior to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, by the progressive celebration of abortion as a sacrament. To shout your abortion is to declare that the most moral thing you can do is to kill an innocent unborn child as an act of individual expression. And that does rub up against people's moral sensibilities. And the other thing that will force this issue is the high levels of abortion. So Philip Pilkington, who is a nemesis of the Pimlico guys, raised the issue that a third of all pregnancies in Britain now end in abortion. Now, if you don't think that 1/3 of all children conceived being killed in the womb is going to disconcert some people when they find out about it, especially at increasingly late stages because it has been decriminalized, then I'm sorry, but you're taking a very short-sighted issue on whether or not this settlement will last. Like, and when people go rooting around for answers, I think a lot of people are going to have the same journey that I did, that go, okay, they're going to keep asking why. Like, why shouldn't you kill this child if you are in economic dire straits, if you are not ready for it yet, emotionally, subjectively, if you have gotten pregnant by a man that you don't plan to have children with, you've not read Louise Perry's book and you haven't taken the Maiden Mother Matriarch advice. Why shouldn't you? Okay, is an innocent life of instrumental worth, or is it of absolute worth? If you say instrumental, good luck squaring the circle of human rights. If you say absolute, you say why. And there is no other answer that I have found to be satisfying other than Imago Dei. Made in the image of God, whether you like it or not. So, when you get to that, that becomes an irresolvable contradiction with the prevailing liberal morality, which says not only don't talk about abortion, but don't touch present abortion laws, because individual autonomy matters more than the sanctity of a life that I can't see. And so you're not going to get people who are increasingly getting on board with this position, even people who were previously pro-choice, even someone like Nigel Farage, who, as you said, would lose political capital talking about this, and off the cuff he did. You're not going to get people to not talk about that when it troubles their conscience. So I think this is a short-sighted attempt to keep right-wing politics on liberal rails. And I also don't think that without Christianity as your guiding North Star, even though you don't have to be an explicitly Christian party, I don't see how you address all of the social concerns that are still going to exist when you have twiddled the dials on education and economics and done mass deportations. There are going to be lots of people who, in a materialistic, liberal, hedonistic morality, and I'm not trying to be disparaging with any of those terms, I literally mean that the purpose of life is to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. It is to survive, and therefore the moment that you are impaired, your ability to have joyous experiences is diminished by an illness or age. The moment that you are incurring costs on another or the state, well, then you should just press the suicide booth and check out. You aren't going to get people to refrain from doing that, from justifying atrocities like late-term abortion or euthanasia, even if you personally, as a conservative Christian, abhor them. You're not going to get the general public to do that without valuing life in and of itself, without turning to Imago Dei in Genesis or the letters of Paul saying neither Jew nor Greek, we're all one in Christ Jesus. You're not going to find that solution outside of a revival of Christianity, which is our historic ethic. Someone's put, the main problem we face as the young right is the weakness and cowardice of our boomer leaders. I think I'll write a book about the Great Betrayal. I encourage everyone to engage in intellectual exercises. We have to build a parallel intellectual ecosystem at the moment because our boomer leaders, they barely read, they haven't examined their own priors, and the arrogance of them means that they will just double down on the failed ideologies that brought us to this point while pulling the ladder up after themselves for people who are looking to novel solutions. So definitely encourage you to do that. So, he writes, the best way to avoid worsening the current settlement on such things is to, in fact, avoid bringing them up in the first place, not to actively campaign on them. The poor return on these issues has already been made clear. Nigel Farage is still hit with anti-abortion accusations for having tepidly suggested that lowering the term limit from 24 to 22 weeks might be sensible, and assisted suicide is perhaps the most popular policy in recent memory, and that popularity extends even to generally conservative-minded voters. Again, very short term, because when the excesses of this policy begin to manifest, as they have in Canada, and they are amplified by Britain's much more lively alternative media space, Pimlico Journal included. Canada doesn't really have that. Mainly because it's a very left-wing country, unfortunately, especially the boomers, and censorship has made some people more sensitive about being outspoken. But it is short-sighted to think that those atrocious edge cases that will become increasingly more common will not put the public off of this. In the same way that people weren't really bothered about Islam until all the terror attacks started happening. And it's become one of the most salient issues. People weren't really bothered about immigration when it was in the infinitesimally small numbers, and they were bothered about it for logistical reasons when it was Europeans, but since the Boris wave and millions of third worlders are now just milling about in your high street, now they're more concerned with culture and identity. Now the conversation about ethno-nationalism and what is an Englishman has become such a fever pitch that even the Home Secretary is addressing it in her Labour Party conference speech. So I think, so he goes on, a lot of this is and I'm not saying this is a fallacy, but he is appealing to popularity and political strategy and expediency. And that is understandable. It is arguable that in the pursuit of political power you have to make compromises. So, Trump administration, for example, J.D. Vance obviously opposed to abortion in all cases as a committed Catholic. However, during the election, they had to walk the tightrope of not wanting to touch the legal settlement of Roe v. Wade, returning it to the states, while also personally opposing abortion. And so they just talked around the issue, right? frustrating. They even made too many concessions on abortifacient pills for my liking, because the majority of abortions now happen with those pills, and they can be sent through the post as they can in the UK. That's one of the reasons for decriminalisation. So I think they made far too many concessions on that. However, if you want to say it got them into power by avoiding that issue, and then from there they can go to March for Life, they can make pro-life legislation, they can appoint Supreme Court justices that overturn things like Roe v. Wade or Obergefell. Okay, you can make that argument. The problem you have, though, is it's a very different case in the Republican Party. Because even though the Republican Party is notorious for being full of, at the moment, Jewish lobbyists, Indians, and gay staffers, just true, they still have a much higher proportion of committed Christians than pretty much every other political party in the Anglosphere. And so, if you're going to say Reform shouldn't be an exoteric political party, exoteric to Christian, they shouldn't campaign on Christianity, they should be like you, they should be a private conservative Christian, but they shouldn't be Christian nationalists. But you would agree, I presume, author of this piece, if you're watching, all this meant in good faith, you would agree that they should allow Christianity, because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, to guide their lawmaking. Then the problem you have is their party's not full of Christians. Their party is 2 for 2 on Muslim and Christian spokespeople. They have a gay chairman who is pro-putting transgender people in prisons that they self-identify with, and who said, Britain is a nation of immigrants and immigration has been the lifeblood of this country. Nigel Farage is hardly the paragon of Christian virtue, because he's been married 3 times, and, well, his affairs are well known. Also, I think at this point, his liver looks like a Dalmatian. He's not one for prudence, unrestraint, as preached by St. Paul. And then you have Richard Tice, who, cheated on his missus with Isabel Oakeshott, and, he's known as Boomer Tice for a reason, right? So, and then Sarah Pochin, she says some base things on adverts and the burqa, good for her, but she also went to an Afghan refugees welcome event and spoke at a pride event full of drag queens. So, look, Reform are hardly a Christian nationalist party, because they're not even a party that runs on Christian conviction. So the problem you have is, even if this is just a quiet electoral strategy, you don't want them to be vocally Christian, despite the young male vote that they're trying to court, then what you're going to have is a problem. Sorry, I just had to mute someone for spamming. What you are going to have is a problem where they get into government and they are battered around by external forces and circumstances without having a strong principle on which to make their laws. So, I'll just finish here. It says, thankfully, while these currents are gaining some traction online, they seem to be receding among those who will actually set the agenda for your future Reform government. It may ultimately prove fortuitous that Rupert Lowe, for all his good qualities, ended up isolated from Reform, as his new vehicle seems to have hoovered up a number of the most egregious offenders in this regard, especially those associated with the Lotus Eaters, which, again, I think for reasons of post-liberalism, Pimlico Journal just has a problem with. They're rather disparaging about us guys, but I'm not going to return the favour. I can recognise they do good work. And nobody with any history of involvement with Lowe will be granted any kind of position in Reform for the foreseeable future. This is absolutely true, but the purpose of Restore Britain, which is why it's not a political party, is to change the parameters of acceptable discourse in Britain. And it has achieved, because forcing the issue of mass deportations, as I did at Reform's conference, that Stephen Edgington did when interviewing Nigel Farage, but as Rupert Lowe has, with the largest social media following of any politician, constantly reclipped and circulated by online anons, it's forced the Labour government to now at least sound like they're trying to get deportations done. It's a bait and switch, it's a smokescreen, they're going to bring over new people on new safe and legal routes, but they feel the pressure to concede to our framing. And Nigel Farage has even said we need mass deportations after only removing Rupert Lowe from the party in March, at least for the public reason being, he said, mass deportations are a dark and dangerous use of rhetoric. So, the idea again that the terms of political engagement will not change between now and the next election, or after, I might add, is short-sighted by this author. This wasn't the only piece. This was not the only piece in the space of a week. The other piece, as you will have seen in the thumbnail, is in Unherd. Now, as you know, Unherd is one of the premium publications by the Marshall Network. You have The Spectator, you have Unherd, you have The Critic, you are going to have the Telegraph soon, because, as it turns out, Redbird Capital, who sold the Spectator to Paul Marshall, is now going to team up with the Daily Mail to buy the Telegraph. So you can only assume it's going to be one of the castles in the Marshall network very soon. They have Policy Exchange, they have the Conservative Party, and they have Reform in the figure of Zia Yusuf. So Unherd is an unabashed liberal network that wants to ensure the conversation only goes in one direction. And the reason I've pulled this up is because I mentioned, and curiously, I mentioned in conjunction with James Orr, who's mentioned in conjunction with J.D. Vance, during the proxy war to get Vance unseated as the presumptive Republican nominee and to put someone like Ted Cruz in instead. Or possibly even Nikki Haley, who's probably going to go on a redemption arc because her son is pretty based. He's one of us, right? So this has been written by Samuel Rubenstein. And okay, chat, let's address the yarmulke in the room. We're trying to be spirited here. We're making jokes. It's fine. I'm not going to be rude to the guy. He's been very polite to me on Twitter. I don't know if he's religious, but given it's a Saturday, he might have to watch this on catch-up. Samuel Rubenstein would not write an article saying, is the Conservative Party too Jewish? I don't know, again, if he is a religious Jew. He writes mainly about Jewish issues, as I've noticed, for his output for The Critic, for The Spectator, for Unheard. Again, writing for the Marshall Network, because they've captured pretty much everything. But, you know, Gen Z has an Israel problem. Gary Lineker doesn't understand the Holocaust. He writes about Jordan Peterson, says that he doesn't really understand the Bible. He writes about Morris Glassman, and he himself is a former leftist. And so, I don't detect any criticism of an overrepresentation of Jewish people in the Conservative Party, for example. Now, there are. This is just being frank. It's not being insulting. But there are a Conservative Friends of Israel, and they host the sort of large drinks event night, a Conservative Party conference. When I went, that would have always the biggest headline speakers, like the Foreign Secretary or the Home Secretary would always go and speak there, and they'd get lots of free drinks. Robert Jenrick, the suggestion that he might have beaten Kemi Badenoch, even though she had Michael Gove and the Spectator and the Telegraph and all that in her corner, was because his wife is Jewish, his kids are Jewish. I think he's converted. And he said that he wants the Star of David flying over every passport gate so that Israeli citizens can use the passport fast-track system in the UK that's afforded to South Korea, Japan, America, Australia, some EU countries, and obviously British citizens. He wanted Israel to be added to that. And the suggestion is why he might have won is because there were whispers in Westminster that he had all the Jewish donors in his corner because they weren't backing Badenoch. So, there is a very heavy Jewish presence in the Conservative Party. They're certainly not going to go to the Labour Party, right? It's full of Muslims and Jeremy Corbyn. Though, to be fair, the British Board of Deputies is a very left-wing organisation, and they constantly push for mass migration and complain about Islamophobia. So they are, as Renaud Camus once said, soaring off the branch upon which they sit. It's like a lot of Jewish people voting for Kamala Harris or Zoran Mamdani. It's just like, what are you going to do? Suicidal liberalism, guys. Happens. So the idea that a piece would be written about the Conservative Party being too Jewish, when, you know, Paul Marshall's wife, Jewish, Michael Gove's girlfriend, Jewish, the idea that would be written would be far beyond the pale. And so, look, I'm not being disparaging about that, but it is a double standard. And it's a double standard which is knowingly platformed by Unheard. And again, I don't think this article was malicious. I do think it was a bit of a guilt by association. The reason I brought this one up, by the way, is because Sam has written some really good stuff in the past, so I don't want to be disparaging to him. I didn't even realise this was him. I was just looking for his work at The Spectator, and this was a really good piece on the, you know, Nick 30 Ons meme, the social contract, where he's got his head in his hands because his money's going to Karim and Simon and Linda. But, just happened to notice, this wasn't a very good piece. And in this piece, James Orr's affiliation with Reform is used to play a guilt by association game with the presence of me in politics. I'm sure that Sam didn't know that James went to my wedding, that we're friends, but he's written to play a guilt by association game to try and get Reform to distance itself from this growing Christian sphere. Strange things are afoot on the religious right, especially on the younger end. The self-declared reactionary Catholic Zoomer, Connor Tomlinson, hello, who is close to Liz Truss and I and Hersey Ali and boasts almost 100,000 followers on X, questions whether those adhering to any other faith than Christian, or belonging to any ethnicity besides British, should be allowed to hold public office. So what's being done there is pointing out my prominence. It's my connection to prominent people. Yes, Liz is a friend. I haven't spoken to I Am for quite some time, unfortunately, but that's because she's got life things going on. And yes, I do now have over 100,000 followers. I'm sure I gained a couple when I tweeted out this piece. But what's curious about this is I am being used to smear James Orr's reputation, to thereby try and distance reform from Christianity in a way that the Conservative Party is not required to distance from Judaism or just the Labour Party from Islam. And the other curious thing about this is this hyperlink here. So if we copy this address, I'm just going to try and pull this up because the post in question, and it is archived, someone archived it, thank you very much. The post in question is my account of my debate with Michael Gove. So, Unherd, which has the same editorial company as The Spectator, Old Queen Street Media. Old Queen Street Media and The Spectator saw fit to censor my debate footage with Michael Gove. But they'll allow a piece criticising me for trying to bring Christian nationalism to the UK, something I don't even subscribe to, by linking to my version of events about the debate. And so this is how containment works. And I'm not accusing Sam of doing this, because again, he's been very polite to me. I'm accusing Unherd of doing this. They will talk about you, but they'll never talk to you. They won't platform you. They'll talk about the issues you are concerned about, but always in a disparaging or carefully controlled fashion. But they, despite the fact that you have a organic audience of some description, I regularly get more viewers than Unheard videos. And I'm sure my articles are read at competitive rates to Unheard, at least. But you don't get spoken to. You don't get a right of reply. I mean, I'm banned from the premises, let alone publishing in their outlet. And also, they will refer to something you have already said that they themselves have actively censored in order to try and control the narrative. Because yet again, they aren't publishing pieces about other parties being too close to other religions. To be fair, they did publish a piece about a Muslim radical being given a seat at the table for Keir Starmer, but they haven't said, is the Labour Party too Islamic? And they also haven't platformed the opposite view, despite being committed to free speech, at least in principle, right? There is an editorial line. They're honest about their editorial line, and I just think the editorial line is bad. I think it's going against the grain. I think it's not in lockstep with the growing current of right-wing thought. And I found it just very curious that my name was being used by people who want to keep the conversation on the right, with Pimlico Journal, or Unheard in the kind of millennial centre-left, the sort of free speech crowd, the left me, the woke went too far crowd. They want to keep it very much within the parameters of value pluralist, agnostic liberalism. And they're using me or Calvin Robinson to try and say, well, this is far too far. This is beyond the pale. This is Christian nationalism. This is unpalatable to the British public. It isn't electable. And so to get the likes of James Orr to renounce anything that smells of our brand of politics, with which Christianity is very honestly woven in, but also to try and get Reform to distance themselves from us. Now, I don't know if Sam knows this, but I'm not allowed to speak at Reform events as of very recently because someone, we don't know who still, but someone told the local associations that I'm not on the approved speakers list. And it might be because of this reason, it might be because of any number of reasons, because I don't really like people who, despite voting for them, criticize them when they do obvious things wrong. But it's obviously a game of reputation, smears, and destruction to try to ensure that parties and press outlets like Unheard only platform one narrow band of viewpoints, which is stigmatizing Christianity and ostracizing the growing cohort of competent young men who, as Pimlico rightly identified, are characteristic of something like Restore Britain, who are well-read, whose eyes are free of the scales of liberalism, and who are committed Christians. And this should be celebrated because I mean, if you are a Christian and you're a practicing Christian, then you shouldn't be susceptible to any of the vices that waylaid the last Conservative government, because it is basically an open secret in Westminster, and lots of people have written about this before, that there were sexual blackmail operations going on. There were Conservative politicians going to the stately homes of one Dougie Smith when he was running sex parties and orgies in said stately homes. Dougie Smith being the guy who runs Conservative candidate selection. He's been nicknamed the Wolf, you know, the guy from Pulp Fiction, because anytime people question why is he on the Conservative HQ payroll, well, those questions quietly disappear if you want to keep your seat. He's married to Munira Mirza, by the way. Munira Mirza is the woman who runs partially the Aquano project, run by Inaya Falarin Iman, who keeps writing hit pieces about me and Harrison Pitt and Steve Edgington, calling us all white identitarians and white nationalists and obsessed with race, despite every other group being allowed to play identity politics except our own. And she also runs, Munira Mirza runs Civic Future, which is like a civil servant training body. She now works in number 10 Downing Street, I think, as a Labour advisor, despite working for Boris Johnson as an advisor while he was the mayor and in Downing Street. She was one of the first to resign, by the way, if you remember, when Boris Johnson blamed Keir Starmer for the Jimmy Savile scandal. She was the first to walk out in a huff, and this sort of set the dominoes falling for Boris Johnson's government to get Rishi Sunak in, who was their preferred candidate. Not that, like Boris, he's a traitor. He should be crow food and gibbeted in the Tower of London. But they didn't like Boris Johnson. They wanted their personnel in instead. So all of these people would like to contain the conversation. They would like to have their preferred candidates in their parties leading them, or at least next in line to lead them. They would like to have their brand of liberalism ubiquitous across Labour, the Conservatives, Reform. And so they use their press outlets to platform certain opinions that keep it that way, and they gatekeep out certain people. Some up-and-comers like Charlie Downs or Lewis Brackpool or Harrison Pitt, they gatekeep them out of opportunities, which is why I've advocated to go to their events and, you know, become a problem in the Q&A. And so, if this event interests you, because it looks quite interesting, for example, this is Onward. So Onward is another think tank in the sort of Marshall sphere. And it is connected to the Looking for Growth group, which is Dominic Cummings's thing, right? It's another one of these, we can just do things, let's pursue AI and technological progress, and wokeness is just momentarily annoying and stupid and we can dismiss it. One of those groups, one of those mentalities. Onward is led by a chap called Sebastian Payne. Sebastian Payne was parachuted into Michael Gove's seat after Michael Gove said he wasn't running again. He's basically a Michael Gove mini-me. He was an advisor to Michael Gove for many years. And Michael Gove is on the board of Onward. So he's doing a speech, actually, and doing a panel discussion. Oh, it already took place. There you go. So, it already took place. Smooth. Well done, Connor. Well done for noticing this. But my broader point was, get on the list of these events, because they do them. They do just sort of sit around, you know, huffing one another's farts and talking about policies that they all agree on. You should be going to these. They give you ample opportunities to go up in the Q&A and challenge people, and so you should be going up and asking them questions as to why they think, you know, for example, Christianity shouldn't be allowed in public life. Why they ardently defend Israel's right to be an ethno-state, but they say that Britain should be multicultural and value pluralist and should accept infinity immigrants from Africa and the Middle East. Or why the debate footage they already filmed was censored. Now, that would be a good idea. Just, you know, go up and ask the questions that they don't want to address. And you should be very suspect of this sort of push to stigmatize Christian nationalism or Christianity in politics, because this came out the same week. So there was a Sky News sort of mini doc, and it was attacking not Reform UK, it wasn't attacking James Orr, it wasn't attacking me, you know, I wasn't mentioned in this, or any of my friends. Instead, it was targeting the Unite the Kingdom rally, where a bunch of well-meaning boomers turned out for a day of waving flags and listening to Tommy Robinson speak. I'm not disparaging that in any way. There's a different kind of politics being done there. Clearly, Keir Starmer felt the pressure of having a few 100,000 to 1 million people peacefully outside Westminster complaining about the state of the country, because it was all he could talk about while at Labour Party conference. So these protests do serve a purpose, even if they are just a political rock concert. And this is why Sky News has taken aim at them. And there is a different kind of Christian politics being practiced here. There is a very evangelical Christian politics being practiced by carrying crosses around, shouting Christ is King, which is true, of course. But there is a as a kind of ostentatious Christianity that just isn't really my style. Not going to disparage it. However, it has been targeted here because it is a very strong show of force, and they're accusing it of being an American import, and it kind of is. So the reason people are chatting Christ is King is because there was this whole Christ is King argument to do with, yes, the Groypers at one point. I'm sure some of you are in chat. Hello, lads. But also just the argument that, what was it? Daily Wire, there was Jordan Peterson at one point released a report with a left-wing group saying Christ is King is anti-Semitic. Andrew Clavin said something similar, and then Candace Owens, while she was still working there, just kept saying Christ is King basically to wind Ben Shapiro up. So the reason it's being chanted and shouted now is because in America they were told they can't say it, so of course they reaffirmed their faith, and now it's been exported over from America as a show, a public proclamation of faith. And again, I don't necessarily want to discourage it, it's just not my style. So I went to the Charlie Kirk Memorial in London in the immediate aftermath of his death. I didn't publicise it because it wasn't about me. A few people said hello there. There were, to the chap who asked for a photo, and I said, no, it's not the place because it isn't about me. I apologise, but that was my mentality of it. There was a very different mentality by some of the people involved in the memorial, because I had to tell one guy to stop shouting, oh, Tommy, Tommy, because he'd had a few beers and showed up before, pipe down, mate. But there was a mentality of, one, they did the hacker, which I just thought was, Charlie Kirk was a Christian. I think he was a Lutheran, and his wife's Catholic. So, he would find this weird pagan multicultural ritual to be stupid. Why'd they bring them over for Unite the Kingdom anyway? But there was a lot of chanting of Christ is King, and I understand the wanting to show solidarity, it felt a bit performative. Anyway, Sky News have taken aim at this sort of public expression of Christianity. You can see the sort of attack on the we're doing things in Westminster, Christians that through sheer force of will having gate kept out of every outlet and citadel on the ostensible right that are making substantive change to the Overton window that now have friends in Parliament like James Murdoch or Rupert Lowe. You can see the attack on them, but you can also see the attack on the street movement, because the street movement is getting increasingly Christian as well. And I think it's getting increasingly Christian because this is an explicitly anti-Islam movement. Unite the Kingdom is actually too soft a movement for me. It's well-natured, but when Tommy Robinson, for example, says that ethnicity is immaterial to being British, and that's just incorrect. It's factually incorrect. It's not a statement of contempt to people with other ethnicities. I'm sure we all know plenty of people who are not our ethnic kin who are very polite. But that doesn't change the fact that being British, being English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish is a matter of ancestry, not a matter of values or just being nice. And also, it is an explicitly anti-Islam movement, but it's like pro-Hindu, and there are Israeli flags being waved, and it's just like, okay, right, no. Sorry, again, no, not being malicious to the nice people from those countries, but can we just have a thing for us, please? Like, can we talk about the we that is currently under siege in our countries? I like that we have well-meaning friends from overseas. Like, I like the American State Department declaring the displacement of Englishmen from London to be a human rights violation. I like that. I appreciate it. But is it possible to just have our thing? So, anyway, Unite the Kingdom it's not in my... I'm trying to word this very carefully because I don't want to be disparaging. It is not where my politics are at the moment. It's just a little bit softer than I am. And it's probably to build a mass movement, right? But it is a mass movement. It's undeniably a mass movement. It's a mass movement that the government feels is breathing down their neck. And this is why Tommy Robinson has had a lot of clout gained in the last year. He's been platformed by a lot more people, even though it's not mainstream television. And this is undeniable, in the reputation battle by the pro-Israel side, they have been very keen to rehabilitate Tommy Robinson because Tommy has been right on the grooming gangs and on Islam. And so, he went on tour with, wasn't it an Israeli government minister or something? He did like a state visit recently. I know some of the people that went with him. And he was obviously platformed by Trigonometry, and Constant is very pro-Israel, skeptical of Islam, etc. And again, Constant, very polite to me. I've been invited to the Trigonometry Christmas party. It's like the only event that I'm not banned from this year, so thanks. So I'm not being rude to those guys. I'm just noticing patterns. Anyway, this is clearly a threat to the ruling establishment. And they've tried to use Tommy Robinson's name as a bogeyman to gatekeep right-wing politics for years, and now the magic spell has worn off. And so Sky News, in the same sort of week that I had a hit piece on me, thank you for the £5 super chat, appreciate it. In the same week that I had a hit piece put out on me, they put out a hit piece on a bishop who's been baptizing people in the Cornish Sea. This is Bishop Serion Dewar. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, sir. And all of these people seem... And they also spoke to the guy who said that he heard Tommy's testimony while he was in prison, that he affirmed the truth of Christ. All of these people are far softer than I am. Like, they're saying, well, they disagree with other religions, and if other religions cause disproportionate amounts of crime in the country, then they're incompatible, and so the people that caused the crime should go back, but they're not saying Muslims are bad people, etc., etc. Like, they still feel the pressure to cave to the malign accusations of the mainstream media. And the idea that these people are the sort of... The idea that they're even close to the Presbyterian Taliban guys out in... Oh, what's it called? In Ohio. Damn, I met some of these guys, Gabe and Toby and Joel Webben. The idea that they're even as close in terms of being militant Protestants to those guys is absurd. So again, Christian nationalism is sort of phantom in Britain. But you can see that they're anxious about the fact that there is a consciousness awakening among not just the vanguard of the British right that are proximate to Westminster, like Downes and myself and Lewis, who needs to be Catholic. I know you're watching, Lewis. But there is also a consciousness arising within the English people who, even if they're not church-going Christians, an increasing number of them are, but even if they're not, they're willing to stand alongside their fellow Christians because they see Christianity as the substrate of their civilization that should be defended against a rival comprehensive doctrine of the good in Islam. What they're seeing here is friend-enemy politics, and this is why the liberal press are petrified, because they can't put the obscuring veil of value-neutral liberalism over British politics anymore. What they're seeing is an identity among the English becoming salient. And the interesting thing about the Pimlico Journal and Unherd pieces, which are also trying to keep this sort of liberal, non-identitarian politics in place, it is not just ethnic. It codes ethnic, but it's not just ethnic. It is also religious. It is almost explicitly Christian. And even if this is just overtures made to our Christian roots and our Christian values and our Christian foundations, and even if some of that is just a sales pitch to say, and we both share the Bible with Israel, therefore we should be friendly with Israel, it is, in effect, a Christian nationalist street protest movement. And so this is what's petrified them. It codes Christian nationalist. And they are trying to, yet again, contain the organic outrage of the British public, the comprehensive, indigestible convictions of young men moving through politics through sheer force of will. They're trying to contain this and keep it liberal. The problem is, liberalism brought us to this point, so why would we think that doubling down on it would be any better? Why would we try and adopt the sort of militant secularism of Singapore when even the guy who enforced that said, I'd rather be Britain, I'd rather be high trust, homogenous, ethnically, I'd rather have one coherent faith, Christianity, that produces this highest trust society, rather than needing to be a Leviathan state trying to keep the peace between all these disparate groups. If we just didn't have those groups here, we would be fine. And there is the recognition of that, and that's why there is the insistence from liberals on the left that you can't notice any differences. But there's also this just ickiness from the liberals on the right who think that any conversation about culture is a distraction, but they don't understand that all of their desire for competition and small p progress and efficiency rest on Christian givens. Yet again, how do you embark on a scientific enterprise that isn't ideologically captured through something like contorting science towards appeasing the delusions of gender-confused people, if not for committing to truth as a value in and of itself? truth that is not instrumental to any one person's desire, their drive to express themselves as an authentic expression of their freedom, which is the maximum good. How do you stop it from degenerating into that, from science being a servant of ideology, without valuing truth in and of itself, without believing there is a capital T truth? And you don't get that capital T truth without Christianity, and that's why the scientific revolution came out of Christianity. That's why it was a great mistake to basically allow liberalism to cede itself the supreme position above all philosophy with Enlightenment. I think the first person that coined the idea of an age of enlightenment was Immanuel Kant, and Kant is responsible for a lot of this liberal, self-authoring subject, global government, one universal system for the presumptive shared nature of all mankind bullshit. Like, read Kant's, what's it called? Principles of Peace. That awful essay that says that we basically need a proto-United Nations. You can't make one universal, value-neutral system which all people give assent to, because comprehensive metaphysical doctrines of the good are not just tack-ons to a egalitarian nature that says that we all act as rational economic actors. They're not digestible. There will be people that act on them more than they do economic incentives provided by a liberal Leviathan state, even if that liberal Leviathan state wants to allow people to indulge in drinking and gambling and things that give life colour. According to the people that think that Christian moralizers who want to ban sports betting and porn are just, fuddy-duddies from the 90s who lost us the war against the liberals because they wanted to ban Grand Theft Auto or something. I don't think that mode of doing politics will succeed, because it's founded on a false anthropology of human beings, and it's a political project doomed to fail because it cannot take into account the fact that cultures are indigestible and they don't share your priors, and that you actually are resting on a set of priors that you yourself are not only not guaranteeing, but taking a jackhammer to. And I think that it's actually an encouraging sign that all of these pieces come out conspicuously at the same time. I want to finish, if I may, on one final strain. So there was this piece, the pro-liberalism side of the left wing, and I'm going to do a video on it, probably at some point. It's written by John Gray, the guy who wrote, what's the title of his book? New Leviathans. Came out in 2023. And he is actually advising a neutral secular Leviathan as the one antidote to the present problems of British society. And you might ask, well, why doesn't he go down the Lee Kuan Yew in reverse route and basically return Britain back to the ethnically and culturally homogenous country that Lee Kuan Yew admired and tried to reverse engineer in Singapore? And it's because he says, there's a passage here. It says, if a reform-led government collapses under the weight of his empty promises, trust in democratic politics will be damaged irreparably. More extreme forces like those manifested themselves in the mass demonstration orchestrated by Tommy Robinson in London last month, there you go, will grow in strength. Riven by ethnic and sectarian divisions, implying that there can be such a thing as people being wholly unified without those ethnic and sectarian religious divisions causing irreconcilable differences, causing friend-enemy, yet again, want to drop the veil of neutrality over to mask existential threats. But anyway, riven by ethnic and sectarian divisions and insurgent movements of the far left and right, Britain could become a failed state, as if it isn't already. There was a section here that preceded this, because this is the Boomer Spectre, right? Just like Pat Buchanan is like the Boomer Spectre on the Republican left and right, Enoch Powell, despite his funeral being attended by Tony Blair and Margaret Thatcher, is the Boomer Spectre on the right and left in the UK. And it says, Windrush generation of Commonwealth immigrants were absorbed and most prospered. Enoch Powell lost his gamble on a politics of white identity. Demonizing popular resistance to continued large-scale immigration could reanimate that ugly spectre. Right, so the Leviathan state is the only acceptable answer. And you only want to dampen down mass migration because you want to stop the public being outraged or noticing these indigestible ethnic and religious differences between them and imported others. You only want to put a stop to that managed public perception, and you are willing to take the trade-off of a liberal totalitarian state that intervenes in all spheres of life to ensure that no one is enforcing a given conception of the good on the other. You're willing to take that trade-off because noticing differences is impolite and unpalatable to you. Because your sentimental attachment to the liberal dream of the blank slate, to the idea that, well, everyone's just sort of a decent chap and we can all get along, which you formulated in a almost entirely homogenous country, culturally and ethnically, you aren't willing to let go of that dream even though the conditions have changed. What you're seeing is the rise in consciousness among the general public at Unite the Kingdom, but also people like myself, and Downs and Pitt, of themselves as Englishmen, white Englishmen, though that's a redundancy, and as Christians, in reaction to the destruction of their society by liberal pluralism, which always seems to cleave in favour of imported anti-white tribal vindictive minorities, and the rising presence in politics of Islam. And no articles are written about whether or not X party, including Reform, is too Muslim, but the presence of one defecting Christian MP and one Christian spokesman as the potential heir apparent to Nigel Farage, which is the true reason for this attempt at gatekeeping, that is enough to cause multiple complaint pieces about Christianity. And so, what they're recognizing here is they need to play this gatekeeping game to ensure that the only options left on the table are liberal, pluralist multiculturalism that accommodates our antonyms, redefines our identity to say that Shabana Mahmood can be British as you and me, or a giant Leviathan state, which tries to keep the neutral peace, as in Singapore, or as prescribed by Thomas Hobbes. And I actually don't think we need to take either of those options. I think we can just remigrate people who don't belong here. I think that we can do an immigration policy along the line of friends and enemies. The people we like can stay, very small number, as it turns out, because of the content of their character, and the fact that integration rarely happens. And the people who are committing crimes and taking benefits and milling about in town centres and turning the wonderful countryside of Oxfordshire or towns and cities, our ancestral homeland, into a third world slum, they can go back to wherever they actually belong. And that is not mean, it's not vindictive, it's not unchristian. It's just practical and sensible. We can choose a different choice, the choice that basically Lee Kuan Yew had in mind, than Leviathan State, which proscribes the ancestral religion which made our country, or the current UK, which is on track for ethnic and sectarian conflict, which, whether the civic nationalists like it or not, will refute the idea of British values in pretty quick real time. Now, on hit pieces on James Orr, the last one that I'll mention, because this is pertinent. So I've archived it here, because paywall. This is from Charles Moore. Charles Moore's on the board of The Spectator. You can see how this attempt to use the Tucker Fuentes proxy war to take out J.D. Vance as the heir apparent of MAGA is now moving over to Britain, because Charles Moore spends multiple paragraphs in this absolutely shit piece on the Tucker Fuentes exchange. You couldn't get more boomer if you tried. Charles Moore is totally out of touch. He spends multiple paragraphs attacking James Orr. Says, there are ramifications over here in Britain. Vance interests himself in affecting political trends outside America, especially in Britain. He paid a visit here in the summer to advance these, shepherded by Professor James Orr, a theologian who has been described as his philosopher king. Orr is the head of the Centre for Better Britain, the think tank closest to reform. One of the 6 ambitions of CBB declares on its website is acting as a bridge for transatlantic dialogue, fostering collaboration and influencing decision-making in both Britain and the UK. I hope Professor Orr will repudiate the Carlson-Fuentes show. If not, who wants that bridge and that collaboration? Extraordinary to think that as an anti-Semitism re-entrenches itself on the left, there are those who want to revive it on the right. Just see how bad faith it is? It's like, here are people that you have nothing to do with. Are you going to sit there and ritualistically denounce them in a Maoist struggle session? And if not, if you're silent, if you don't respond to the fact that I've just taken a dump on your table and then you tell me how it smells, well, aren't you covering for these people? Fuck you. How about that? Honestly, I'm so tired of this mean girl fucking strategy. It's pathetic. Like, you're a grown man. Do you know how much politics this year has just been babysitting the egos of men 2 or 3 times my age? It's exhausting. It's demoralizing. This is why I am an introvert. So, he writes, Professor Orr has criticized conservatives who suffered from a World War II brain. Yeah. Charles Moore. Because Charles Moore wrote an entire hit piece on James Orr before that I covered in a piece in a video on Danny Finkelstein's awful piece saying like the containment operations are getting desperate. But constantly comparing like the current war in Ukraine to a rerun of World War II, because it's the gravity well around which all of our politics swims, apparently. But he's criticizing conservatives, Charles Moore, for World War II brain refracting almost every geopolitical crisis through the prism of the 1930s and 40s. He has attacked the cult of Winston Churchill, as does Tucker and another of his TV guests, the Holocaust minimizer Darryl Cooper, very careful language not to get sued there, who sees Churchill as the chief villain of World War II. Not something I agree with, by the way. I think it's Hitler, Stalin, and Roosevelt, and I think that Churchill was more hapless than anything else. But besides, he says, I would commend this crew a forthcoming pamphlet from Policy Exchange by Andrew Roberts and Zachary Marsh. It has 2 purposes. The first is to defend Churchill from the faculty false charges levelled at him. The second is to identify the creepy politics that lies behind these attacks. Now, before I move on to that, because it's worth reading briefly, before finishing up, would you like to see what Charles Moore thinks of what Britain has become? It's very similar to John Gray, who thinks of Enoch Powell as the greatest potential political spectre in British politics, because my good friend Harrison Pitt, who does excellent work in his Forge series that more of you should be watching, it's criminally underviewed, hosted a debate between Charles Moore and William Clouston, leader of the SDP, about Margaret Thatcher's legacy. And Charles Moore said that it would be uncivilised to have solved the problem of demographic swamping back when Enoch Powell was warning about it, when Maggie Thatcher was in power, and instead that we should just accept the position with which we are given now. I'll let him speak for himself.
She famously said in 1978, before she was Prime Minister, people don't want to be swamped. She was much attacked by the left of the party for saying it. But the trouble was Enoch Powell, his eloquence, and some people would say his extremism, terrified politicians off the subject. So he may even have achieved the opposite of what he intended by raising it, because it became sort of unsayable. Wasn't completely unsayable by her, and she always maintained it. And it's very interesting that the far right never got a look in her time. She squashed them electorally completely, where they were actually beginning to rise in the 1970s.
If I may just say one, one of the major points that Powell made in 1968 is that we had already, to some extent, piled up our own funeral pyre.
Yes.
This looks more and more vindicated by the day in Britain. We are being swamped, whether or not Thatcher would have liked us to have been swamped. Powell wasn't just urging for a break on numbers, he was urging for civilized reversal of what had already happened. She admired him. I don't think she was particularly squeamish about his, not just his restrictionism, but about his desire to reverse it. Why didn't she do that?
I would say that it wasn't civilized to reverse it, because in order to do it effectively in enough numbers, you would have had to kick people out, and that would not have been civilized. They had arrived by perfectly legitimate means. We're not talking about illegals here. And you couldn't and shouldn't do that. And in terms of the numbers, really the big numbers have come after that.
You couldn't and shouldn't do that. Again, just moral statements with basically zero foundation. It's just, I would feel icky about having to turn people away from my country, despite all homes only being homes if they have the ability to evict unwanted or uninvited guests. And the idea that one parliament should be able to bind its successors in terms of demographics when every single person who is not a native Brit is in the country as a consequence of a political choice, I object to this on moral grounds as well. And this is why we're basically digging down now. This is why these hit pieces against Christian nationalism or anything that codes as collective bargaining by the English and their historic faith, this is why these hit pieces are being written. As Alistair McIntyre observed in After Virtue, R.I.P. If we keep talking long enough, we will realise that we're on parallel moral tracks, and if they ever collide, then it spells disaster. But most political conversations are actually held on completely incommensurate, irreconcilable moral foundations. And one might describe this as friend-enemy. So, those who recognise friend-enemy they're engaging in a politics which has far fewer contradictions. Those who are trying to keep politics on liberal rails are unknowingly pushing the country towards a collision force. And I think Charles Moore embodies this from the boomer perspective, because I think it's frankly far more uncivilized to have allowed the grooming gangs to continue, or to have imported tons of low IQ, schizophrenic African knife murderers like Anthony Williams and Valdo Calacane and Axel Ruda-Cabana. I think it's far more uncivilized to lose your civilization through demographic and cultural change, which the electorate have voted against at every opportunity, than it is to remove some of the troublesome elements who also were not invited here. Like, the Windrush ship were not invited by the British government or the British people. They just rocked up, took advantage of the new Commonwealth system, and then the British Nationality Act that was passed in 1948, because the tickets were going cheap for the ship. So the idea that this entire generation were invited, that they were wanted, hey, I'm sure there's plenty of nice people. Like, I interact with plenty of nice British-born black people all the time. Okay? I try to be as gentlemanly in my conduct to everyone. You can accuse me of being too soft-hearted and liberal. Fine. I'll live with that. But that does not mean the country is precluded from saying, if it so wishes, actually, we don't want these specific people here, and they can return to where they hail from. And this is the intractable blockage. It's people who want to keep politics going in the given direction, where the only choices are, ultimately, a ethnic war that they fear, but they want to do nothing to stop, and so they continue to obscure as the existential threat that is revealed if you allow friend-enemy politics to continue, but is obscured by liberalism, presuming itself to be the neutral arbiter of all value conflicts. Or they propose instead a Leviathan state to conduct integration strategies, whatever that means, to ensure an all-encompassing British identity can take everyone under its wing. So increasingly, this weird sort of obsession by Scots in the Conservative Party, Fraser Nelson, Neil Ferguson, Michael Gove, Andrew Roberts, be led by immigrants like Zia Yusuf or Rishi Sunak or Kemi Badenoch to make the case for integration because they think white men are past it. Something that Neil Ferguson, actually told me at ARC to my face, which I was... You can go and find footage of that. Really revealing moment. So they just want those to be the two solutions. My solution is remigrate the people we don't like, have a high trust, homogenous, cultural, cohesive country again, and we can see if the Christian revival happens organically with a bit of encouragement from new media. And I think that'd be a much nicer country than the complete mess, the global shantytown, the favela in waiting that we have in the moment. So what was the report that Charles Moore referenced in this article? Here's the Policy Exchange report. The reason I'm bringing this up is for two reasons. One, we'll go on to Policy Exchange at the moment. But if I just do a quick search for Lotus Eaters, you won't believe this. The article's about the Lotus Eaters. We've reached new heights where we are spooking legacy institutions into writing full-fledged policy papers about offhand comments that myself, or Josh and Harry especially, made in roundtables about Churchill. And I'm sure the chat's going to light up with the fact that Lotus Eaters has been mentioned. Yes, I did love my time there, just, Swindon's far too far away. And I'm also doing other things as well. It's also quite conspicuous here. So, Zoomer historian who doesn't like me, again, constantly accuses me of being too soft on Twitter. He, I think this was the same week that this was put out, he had his YouTube account deleted. Now, full disclosure, I don't care if he doesn't like me. He shouldn't have a YouTube account deleted. He shouldn't have his livelihood taken away. If he has an audience, he has an audience. And if people want to debate him on whatever he talks about, I haven't actually watched any of his videos, I'm going to be honest. They should just be able to debate that. And if you guys are obsessed with a containment exercise, which deprives them of a platform, but then you talk about them at every opportunity, then it just makes you look dishonest. So anyway, look. The fact that they are feeling nervous enough about this rising consciousness, the questioning of the post-war consensus, whether or not revisiting the actual details of World War II are warranted or done in a sensible way, because as far as I understand it, Darryl Cooper made a number of factual errors in his interview with Joe Rogan. The fact that there is a rising strain of unapologetic Christianity, both among those that work in Westminster and in street protest movements. The fact that we're just saying, nope, sorry, you can't be English. You can't identify it as English. My heritage is not your cosplay. Sorry. The fact that this is now getting a lot of attention from the money-powered parties, institutions, even the government. The fact that this is the conversation going on in the country right now means that we're actually doing things, everyone. Like, the video I put out yesterday about the State Department coming to our aid, the beacons of Gondor being lit, that was meant to encourage people. And look, I know some of the people in the State Department that worked on that stuff. They really care. They're listening. They will watch this video. So know that if you're involved in this conversation, even if it feels small, that we are doing things. The fact that they are scared of us is a positive sign. And this is why I've been encouraging you to go to their events, to go in their comment sections, to comment on their tweets, to ratio them. The amount of people that I've had tweets deleted this week. I ratioed Richard Dawkins the other day, calling him basically a coward about Islam, and he deleted that tweet, complaining about Trump. You should be doing this too. Whether it's anons, because you don't want to put your face out there, you don't want to put your family at risk. This is the reason I always keep my family private, and nobody will know about them. Whether it's you are bold enough to write under your own name, do a podcast, show up to an event on camera and ask a question, which you should do, especially courageous young men, do it. Just look at the way that now all of American politics is reacting to Nick Fuentes, whether or not you like everything he says. You should be doing this. And the fact that some of us are doing it, sort of people that you guys watch, read, etc., and we're now getting like full-fledged policy paper hit pieces on us. Like, from all angles that we are being sniped at and our heels are being nipped at. I think in Sam and Pimlico, well, maybe Pimlico's sense, in good faith. The fact that we're doing that means we're doing things. We are setting the national conversation, whether or not they object to the way that we does it. That wasn't English, was it? Whether or not that they object to the way that we do it. I've clearly been streaming for too long. And here's the other encouraging thing. That we've kind of provoked the nerve center of a particular money power nexus here. Policy Exchange, if you don't know, was set up by Francis Maud, who is Kemi Badenoch's current advisor and a good friend of Michael Gove. And if we just give it a Google, set up by Nicholas Bowles, Michael Gove, and Francis Maud. Policy Exchange building is opposite the Unherd office, on the same street, The Spectator. This is a nexus that doesn't like the Lotus Eaters, it doesn't like Restore UK, or Restore Britain, it doesn't like me very much. I think we can gather that one by now. And so you're seeing the citadels, despite having way more castles and towers, and a very fortified Motte and Bailey, begin to feel the heat of the siege that's gathering at their gates. Are you white-pilling, chat? I'm white-pilling. They can ban me from every event. They can exclude me from every party. They can say what they like about me in their outlet, even though they then accidentally concede, apparently, by publishing a piece that quotes me and then links to my account of the debate, that my account of the debate is correct. Therefore, everyone's saying, well, you must have won the debate then over Gove, and that's the reason he hasn't published it. Maybe true. They can do all these things. They can try to shut it out. They can try and gatekeep us. But, in the words of Ash Sarkar, I think we're winning, lads. Very interesting. Anyway, if there are no more super chats because I was answering them as I was going along, I will quickly check. But if you want any questions asked, get them in now. I'm going to try and do some more of these streams on Saturdays because I rarely go out on a Saturday night because I'm 27, I'm married, I'm hopefully going to have kids next year. I've been renovating my dining room this week. Like, what club am I going to go to? No thanks. So I'm going to try and make Saturday streams a more regular thing. And I'm going to try and address any super chats that I get. And I like this dialogue that we have. It's always appreciated, not just that you guys are willing to keep my efforts to improve things alive, but also that you want direct feedback. American here, how can we help? Well, see, that is appreciated. Thank you for the $20. I mean, sharing content is actually helpful. There are the reason that the people who have dominated the conversation in the last few years have become so successful is because they game the social media system by getting an audience of loyal followers to clip their content for them. So if I say anything that resonates, you have total permission to clip it. If you have a monetized Twitter account, by all means, engagement farm me, right? And also, how can you help? I mean, anytime the Trump administration does something that you approve of, apply a carrot. Anything they do something you disapprove of, apply a stick. And the carrots you should be applying is this recent support sent our way by the State Department, which I'll get up for those of you who missed my video on it. Unforgivable. I mean, first of all, you should watch that video. It was great. I did really well. But the fact that they classified white flight, so demographic displacement caused by mass migration in Britain, in whole areas that have been rendered non-English areas, the fact that they rendered that a human rights concern, you should be if you have an account, you should be posting Patriot underneath it. You should be quote retweeting it with the guy from Dinosaurs that drops the Coke can in awe with the MAGA hat on. Like this is actually really helpful because it creates room for risk-averse politicians to take a harder line on questions of migration, and the government do actually feel the heat on this stuff. So, as an American, what can you do? Support UK creators and British creators. Sorry, hate the UK. And if that's not me, I mean, that's fine. I mean, share the work of my friends, Harrison Pitt, Charlie Downs, subscribe to the Lotus Eaters, do that sort of stuff. There are great UK creators, actually. Morgoth, I even had a good exchange with the guy who had the viral tweet the other day about the left pretending not to know things and dominating discourse, Millennial Woes. He had the charity to share my previous stream on containment. Like, there are plenty of British bloggers and anons and video content creators that you can support. There's an entire parallel ecosystem to the entrenched interests of the Marshall Network and the major political parties that deserve your support. And the fact that just the raw mass of the American audience can help amplify things in algorithms is support enough. Yeah, we've got bills to pay, and yeah, I appreciate every super chat sent my way, and all the people that view things and that subscribe to my Substack. I think that's hopefully getting your money's worth because you're getting multiple posts and analysis. It takes me time to write, and I do actually write it, unlike some other popular Substacks who get ghostwriters that I will not name. But to actually support up-and-coming talent, to amplify their messaging, that's the way you can help. Because there's not much else you can do from across the Atlantic other than show concern and support. And honestly, that's enough. Right. If that's all, ladies and gentlemen, my dinner has been sitting in the oven. My poor wife is probably waiting for me to stop yammering so she can get it out. But thank you all very much for joining me. Turns out the online right has perhaps more power than we thought. And if we're getting slings and arrows from all direction, then maybe we've got some momentum behind us. Cheers all. Share this around if it was helpful. Until Monday, I'll have a video out, hopefully. Take care, God bless, and goodbye.